Hello, everybody. Dear participants in the Europe on the Edge program, my name is Andrea Lenschow. I'm from the University of Osnabrück in Germany, and I'm a professor of European integration and European politics. In my research, I focus on environmental policy, and therefore, I think I've been asked to conduct a little lecture or give an input on the question of what is the natural world in our understanding of citizenship. What I'm going to do is I first sort of give a brief introduction, and then we will have a number of questions. You're used to having a number of questions, I guess, in the meantime. Here are the questions that I will cover in the path of the next 20 minutes or so. So first of all, we will link the question of citizenship to state boundaries and sort of challenge the notion on the basis of a new notion of environmental citizenship. And see what sort of this environmental framework does to our understanding of citizenship. The second question deals with citizens' responsibilities. We will sort of tackle a little bit the balance between duties, responsibilities on the one hand, and citizenship rights on the other hand, and what this implies for a citizenship in the environmental understanding, in this environmental citizenship understanding. And thirdly, we will look at what this means for individual behavior on the one hand and public policy on the other hand. So that's the plan for the next 20 minutes, and I will first motivate a little bit of what we're talking about by telling a couple of brief stories or showing you a couple of maybe challenging pictures. What we see here is sort of a little bit of a water drop in California. California, as you know, suffers from one of the most severe droughts in centuries, and the experience shows that citizens in California, residents of California, are relatively slow in responding to some of the public calls to save water. So therefore we have not only drought, but we also have fires, etc. So one recent environmental crisis in the state of California. Another crisis relates to our oceans. In our oceans we have a lot of plastic swimming around, plastic coming from our households that sort of ended up in the oceans by being dumped in household waste bins, and the statistics show that in some countries an individual household uses up to 1,000 plastic bags each year and sort of drops them all into the waste bin rather than recycling them and putting them to new use. Only less than 3% of all plastic bags are recycled. The rest ends up on waste dumps or even in the oceans, threatening the marine life. Another environmental crisis that we face right now. Third crisis relates to climate change. We all are relatively familiar with the issue of climate change. And here as well, we have sort of a relatively mixed experience of how citizens respond to the crisis. While we have actually a drop in energy consumption, we have still a rise in transport. Particularly in road transport, we see that the numbers of emission are still rising, and that in a way sort of the prospect of achieving the certain goals that we have set publicly for climate change policy may be in trouble to being achieved due to our personal use of not public but private transport. So what do these stories have to do with citizenship? Well, first of all, these stories have a number of things in common, and one of the things is that they, in a way, sort of deal with the conflictual relationship between our individual behavior, our individual preferences of using transport, of doing our shopping, or watering our gardens, and the public good. The public good, and that's linked to this first question, the public good, which is global. It doesn't end at the boundaries. That's, at first sight, of course, a very obvious observation. It's not particularly interesting. So the question, what are the tensions between the common good and state boundaries, might appear almost, or might appear rhetorical, rather than really sort of an analytically insightful question. What goes a little bit deeper, however, is the way we actually conduct our relationship with the public good. On the one hand, we have to sort of observe that in our modern life, the implications of our individual behavior on the global common good are almost inevitable. It's probably it would be backsided to claim that we are sort of focused on the local place we sit, not consume anything that comes from further away, not move across borders. That would be sort of a back step on the path of modern development. Also, it would be considered in sort of radical imposition on our individual freedom. Individual freedoms that obviously sort of over the years we have fought for, that we are free to think, we are free to do, free to move within certain constraints, but generally that is something that we consider our citizenship right. What is interesting in this environmental thing, though, is that we, in a way, sort of exploit our freedoms to very different extents. And that is something that is linked to another concept that I like to introduce to you. That's the concept of ecological footprint. The ecological footprint relates to the notion that we have limited environmental space on planet Earth, and that we are using the space. We are using the resources, we are using the space in a very literal sense. We are doing that to very different extents. So in Europe in particular, but also in North America, we are leaving a big footprint on planet Earth, whereas in other parts of the world, people living there leave a very small footprint. And looking at this picture, we see sort of an image of the European environmental footprint. We see a number of things. First of all, we see that in Europe we've always left a large footprint compared to other parts of the world, and we in a way sort of consumed the Earth as Europeans alone. Even in the 1970s, we left a footprint that was going beyond what was due to us if we assume that each person on planet Earth has the right to leave a footprint and has an equal right to have accessibility to environmental resources. So Europeans always used more than was due to them if we assume this notion of equal distribution. We also see that we consume an increasing portion of the environmental space available. So partly this might be responsible to population growth, but only in part. But we see, looking at the graph here on CO2 emissions, that energy consumption is probably no longer the main story. It has to do with a wider conception of individual consumption, but also with production patterns, industrial production patterns, etc. What we conclude from this is that the reference point for environmental citizenship is the global common good. The idea is that we as individuals can sort of, or should develop an understanding of what our contribution is to protecting the common good or violating the common good. And that normatively speaking, advocates of this environmental citizenship concept say that individual individuals should be responsible for protecting the environment and leaving a fair share of the environment to other people on planet Earth. Obviously, this is sort of a normatively highly loaded conception, and I think, and I also suggest that you in your work groups discuss this very critically, whether this is sort of an overly normative loading of a citizenship concept, because it calls on us to be good citizens, good guys. It interferes in our individual freedom to do whatever we want. We are supposed to sort of constantly reflect on our doing, on our lifestyle, and sort of reflect on the implications that this might have on other parts of the world and the survival of the planet. So some of these questions we are going to get a little bit more in depth into. It's not the right English, but so we will sort of develop some of these notions a little bit more deeply, and first of all look at the question of what citizenship responsibilities follow from the necessity to protect the environment in ways that transboundary effects are respected. Now, this question itself is, in a way, a loaded question. And it implies a certain normative understanding of what environmental citizenship tries to tell us. Because it puts the weight, the bias, on responsibilities rather than rights. That's a debatable thing. Some might argue it might be sort of, well, let's leave it at the debatable thing. I'll leave it to you to actually debate it. The bias on the side of the responsibilities sort of implies that we no longer discuss at length citizenship rights like liberal rights to find a place for residents, to conduct our own business, to travel where we want, to have certain political rights to participate, all these kind of things. That's not the emphasis here. The emphasis is rather how certain rights are constrained and turned into responsibilities towards no longer the state, but now the globe as a whole. So we are looking at the responsibility side of the equation of citizenship rights and citizenship responsibilities or duties. And this is a debatable thing of whether this is actually something that is defendable. In the literature, we have two camps. Probably we're even more camps, but in order to sort of make this plastic, I decided to focus on two camps. The liberal camp, the classical understanding of modern citizenship, which is institution-oriented in speaking about responsibilities. I come to that in a minute. On the one hand, and on the other hand, the post-cosmopolitan notion of environmental citizen. Cosmopolitan because it sort of goes beyond national boundaries. Post because it challenges certain notions of the distinction between public and private, and also, as already mentioned, sort of puts a bias on lifestyle and individual responsibilities. Beginning with a liberal understanding. So a liberal understanding of state citizenship is associated with political theorists or philosophers, John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin, and others, of course. The emphasis here, first of all, lies on the citizenship duties, but to the extent that we speak about responsibilities, responsibilities are conceptualized in relation to the state. So we have certain responsibilities vis-à-vis the state as an institutional framework, and that in a way sort of frames our lives. So the individual the liberal understanding implies that our citizenship responsibilities are vis-à-vis the state, the institutions, and we are supposed to respect certain state-set rules. We're supposed to obey or comply with the law, including environmental law, of course. And furthermore, we are even expected to pursue certain institutional solutions for public good problems. So to the extent that we as citizens of a state experience collective action dilemmata, we are in a way asked to turn to institutional solutions to have the state set certain rules in order to resolve these collective action problems. And the way to do this typically would be by setting rules, by passing laws, possibly by setting certain fiscal incentives. To some extent, one might even think of sort of softer ways of the state interfering in terms of setting incentives in terms of subsidies or something like that. But it would be the state that sort of steers the framework, and we are supposed to sort of follow these state rules. The implication for the citizen, him or herself, is that a citizen doesn't have to be heroic. Citizen may still be selfish, doesn't have to be selfless. A citizen is not expected to be sort of virtuous and a highly moral person. The only thing a citizen is expected to do is to, in a way, obey with state-set rules and to pursue institutional justice. So that's the liberal notion. The contrasting notion linked to this concept of environmental citizenship challenges this and says, well, in a way, sort of the mere institutional orientation it might be insufficient, and that the weight should be much more on the individual, him or herself, and on individual interaction. Individuals are, in a way, expected to be moral beings, and there's a certain understanding of what this means, what is sort of a good citizen, a good environmental citizen ought to do. It interferes in personal lifestyles. So the expectation is that since we as citizens always produce an impact on the public, we are supposed to be, or we can be held responsible for this. So the environmental citizenship concept breaks with a division between public and private. Private is no longer private in the sense that nobody interferes into our private lives, into our private thinking and choices. In fact, we are supposed to sort of open our private sphere and make it, well, turn it into a service to the public good. So the main environmental citizenship responsibility is to reduce one's own ecological footprint to a fair share, in the sense that all the other people living on planet Earth have the equal accessibility to environmental resources. And this might imply changing our lifestyle, changing our driving habits, our washing habits, our watering the garden habits, and traveling habits, etc. So I repeat, we're in a way supposed to sort of constantly think in these environmental terms. So it's an enormous expectation, you gather, that is sort of carried along with this concept. And again, I invite you to discuss critically to what extent this is a realistic expectation and whether it's an appropriate expectation on us as world citizens. But before you do that, you should briefly with me reflect on the final question, which are actually two questions, namely what follows for individual behavior and what for public policy or for politics. And in order to ask or answer rather the first question, what follows for individual behavior, again we sort of turn to these different schools. Because what follows for individual behavior is very different depending on whether you come from the liberal side or whether you come from the post-cosmopolitan side. Coming from the liberal side, the individual behavior in a way is sort of looked at as a behavior outcome, and there's sort of a match between the institutionally set rules and their behavior, and whether this is sort of at an appropriate level. There's no expectation that you must believe in what you do. There's no expectation that as a complying citizen with environmental laws that you actually believe in these laws, as long as you comply. There's no expectation that you are a green, committed, environmentally committed citizen. That's your private business, as long as you comply with the law and to some extent support these laws and might even work towards the establishment of certain laws in order to resolve public action dilemmas. The focus on individual behavior for the post-cosmopolitan scholars would be too shortcut. It would be, they would argue behavior is one thing, but what is really interesting is attitude. So we should look at individual attitudes, and we should work towards changing public attitudes, because it's the attitudes that in the long term actually sustain certain behavior. There's a skepticism that comes along with sort of externally induced behavior, because these externally set rules, they might change. And once they are changed, behavior might change, and sort of the whole benefit of reducing private transport or actually responding to the needs that emerge if there's a local drought, etc. That this is sort of lost once the immediate crisis is gone and the policy that has been established has been removed. So the real focus of the environmental citizenship proponents like Andrew Dobson is attitude. And this, of course, has implications for public policies, because how do you affect attitudes and how do you affect behavior? I already hinted that the liberal school would put a lot of emphasis on state-set rules, laws, or even incentives. To some extent, one could say they have a particular fondness for fiscal incentives, because fiscal incentives leave a lot of personal choice, a lot of room for personal choice, and you can, in a way, sort of decide freely whether you respond to certain incentives or whether you do not respond to certain incentives. Let's imagine a certain tax on certain products. You are free to buy these products. You can use as many plastic bags as you want and pay your 10 cents or whatever it might be each time, if that's the sort of negative incentive that has been set. But you can also sort of be impressed by these 10 cents and say, well, I'd rather spend these 10 cents on something else and sort of reuse my plastic bags. That's up to you. So that's sort of the charm of economic instruments, and liberals would sort of believe in this charm and say, well, this is really sort of the perfect public instrument to use. The post-cosmopolitan school, the environmental citizenship school, says, well, this is all very nice, and it might result in temporary solutions, but it's volatile, and also it doesn't deal with the fact that we as individuals might have a temptation to sort of get around these rules, and maybe don't obey with the law after all because nobody looks, or sort of sneak out a plastic bag because nobody checked. So they would argue that these kind of rules tend to lean towards an unsustainable use, and the behavior may not be sort of change in the very long term. So rather, they would target attitudes. How do you target attitudes? Dobson has written a paper where he sort of really emphasized the educational system as the context where young kids are already sort of educated to become these good citizens, good environmental citizens. So to some extent they're sort of indoctrinated to look at the world in a certain way and to reflect on one's own impact on the global environment. Now, you, I think, heard from on the basis of what I said, that the defensibility of environmental citizenship is potentially a rather tricky thing, because the imposition on individual freedoms is relatively high. One author I read in preparation was sort of arguing that the implication is that we are becoming a rather sort of humorless society, because we all are sort of fixed on looking at the environmental implications. On the other hand, Dobson and colleagues would sort of defend the concept by sort of pointing to the endangered public good. And this is what I would leave to you now to discuss in your working groups, and sort of discuss what are the normative implications, what is this, what kind of citizenship concept is defensible, how much would you think can we intrude in personal liberties, and to what extent should we emphasize responsibility to something like public good. Have good fun with this, and I look forward to hearing or reading some of the results. Thank you. By the way, I listed a couple of references that might interest you, with some of the core authors, Dobson, Rawls, and some of the other sources that I used for this presentation, and I invite you, of course, to take a look. Bye-bye.